Hello, greetings from Booneri. Today's topic is the history of how sign language started. Talking with gestures by your hands is sign language. When did it start? We'll find out today. Since ages, people have been using natural expressions and hand gestures to communicate. For example, the Native Americans had various tribes amongst them, and each tribe differed in their languages. So, how did they communicate with each other? They used hand gestures to communicate with people from the other tribes. In addition to it, in order to facilitate trade with Europeans, they made use of natural signs to communicate. This means of communication was common, and with time, the language barriers were overcome. Researchers who have long studied this believe that the hunters on the open plains in those days used signs to communicate to each other from great distances. These hand shapes were the most sought after method back then. Although signing with hand gestures or expressions was common, there was no official sign language as such. It was only simple conversations. In fact, there was something very peculiar. In ancient Rome, under the Roman law, people who were born deaf were denied the right to sign a will. What is a will? A will is a declaration by a person about his property or material wealth that will be given or distributed after death. People sign a will that is followed after his or her death. But according to ancient customs, people who were deaf were not allowed to sign a will. That was really a harsh means imposed, but this prejudice was fought against because being deaf does not mean that a person was dumb. In those days, they believed that deaf were presumed to understand nothing, as they thought it is not possible that they have been able to learn to read or write. Deaf people can't understand anything. But after revolting against it, this practice was taken off. Who was the first person credited with the formation of sign language? Take a look. The first person to be credited with the creation of a formal sign language was Pedro Ponce de Leon. He was from Spain and was a Benedictine monk. Pedro lived in the 1500s. His idea to use sign language was not a completely new idea, as natural signs were already in use, but there was no such established language back then. Pedro, at his place of worship, had many monks who had dedicated their lives to divine worship. The Benedictine monks had their daily periods of silence, when each of them observed complete silence. It was at that time that he saw some monks use natural signs to convey messages during the periods of silence. Inspired by this practice, Pedro Ponce de Leon adopted the gestures to create a method for teaching the deaf to communicate using sign language. This proved very useful for communication among the deaf. It was because of his teachings that Pedro came to be known as the first teacher of the deaf. Later on, another priest from Spain named Juan Pablo Bonet wrote how some deaf people were struggling. They were put into casks. What are casks? Casks are large containers like barrels that are used for storage. It used to keep liquids or any other food items, or it was used for multi-purpose storage. In those days, the deaf were put into these casks to train them to speak. This was done so because the voice booms and reverberates in such casks, but such violent measures were by no means to the purpose. Hume wrote strongly against it, and so he continued exploring new communication methods. In the year 1620, he published his first work, a manual system in which the right hand made shapes to represent each letter. Unlike ISL, it was the use of one hand to denote alphabets. This enabled the deaf to learn vocabulary using finger-spelled letters. This method surely proved beneficial but had its limitations too, as some deaf couldn't understand it completely. For example, the words and, nor, yet, there were no signs to denote them, as these were abstract terms which could not be shown, while something tangible was easy to explain, as we could feel or see such things. Words like yet are a part of spoken language grammar which was not understandable to the deaf. How was the problem solved? Take a look. Back in the year 1755, a person named Charles Michel de Lippi was a Catholic priest. He observed that although the sign language was helping the deaf, but there were some glitches that had to be worked upon so that it could be understood completely. So he adapted the existing system and even added grammar elements for educating the deaf. This method actually proved useful. He then went on to be the founder of the first public school for deaf children at Paris in France. With his teachings progressing, he further established many more schools. He established 21 schools all over France. Commendable work indeed. Giving due recognition to his work, he came to be known as the father of the deaf. That was truly great. Moving on, back in the year 1814, a person named Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet from USA saw from his window a neighbor aged 9-year-old and who was hearing impaired. With curiosity to communicate and teach her, he went to France to get trained in deaf communication. Years later, Gallaudet established his own American school for the deaf in his hometown, USA. And today, his institution is well known. It is one of the top universities for the deaf, known as the Gallaudet University. It is one of the best universities worldwide. Thanks to the development of formal sign languages, people who are deaf can speak the language of their heart naturally.